Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here today. We are going to take a massive deep dive into, honestly, the strategic unraveling of an absolute empire. We're talking about one of the most consequential periods in human history, examining the complete cascade of blunders that led to the downfall of Adolf Hitler and the Axis powers in World War II. We've got a lot of fascinating ground to cover, so let's just get right into the evidence and see how an unstoppable force was literally broken apart. Okay, picture this. It's July 1940. Germany has occupied nearly all its surrounding countries. Austria, Poland, Norway, Belgium, Denmark, France, they're all gone. Down south, you've got Mussolini in power as an ally, and to the east, Hitler actually has a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Oh, and the United States? They wanted absolutely nothing to do with this conflict. Germany looked literally unstoppable. There was basically just one major power left standing in Hitler's way. So the monumental question is, how on earth did he lose it all?
Section 1. Britain stands alone. The first turning point.
Okay, let's dive into this. At this exact moment in 1940, Hitler genuinely expected Britain to look at these totally overwhelming odds, realize they were completely beaten, and just sign a peace treaty. But Winston Churchill had other plans. He delivered that iconic, defiant response, making it crystal clear that there would be no surrender. Because of this totally unwavering stance, Hitler realized he had no choice, and he had to plan a full-on invasion of the UK, Operation Sea Lion. But there was a massive logistical nightmare he had to solve first. You see, there's no land bridge to the UK. You have to go by sea. But the British Royal Navy was vastly superior to Germany's naval forces, so Hitler's only real option was to completely dominate the skies first. Look at these numbers, guys. It is a terrifying David versus Goliath scenario. The German Luftwaffe had 2,600 aircraft, while the British Royal Air Force, the RAF, had just 700. On paper, this looks like an absolutely guaranteed German victory. But right here is where the tactical blunders really start piling up. Germany's initial strategy was actually pretty sound, focused on destroying British airfields and factories. Simple, right? Well, on August 24th, German pilots accidentally bombed London. Churchill was absolutely stunned, and he immediately retaliated by bombing Berlin. This totally infuriated Hitler, so he completely scrapped his military strategy and ordered an all-out attack just to destroy London. Fast forward to September 15th, 1,120 German aircraft swarm the skies over London. The British RAF meets them with barely 630 planes, and against all odds, the British crushed them. They downed over 60 German planes and only lost 29. It became known as Battle of Britain Day, and it handed Hitler his very first major defeat. So you really have to ask yourself, how does an overpowered, numerically superior force just lose like that? It comes down to one absolutely crucial element, the motivation factor. Think about it. When an army invades, those soldiers are fighting to gain something. But for the defending country, it's literally a matter of absolute survival. If they lose, their country is wiped off the map. This fierce existential drive gave those vastly outnumbered British pilots a massive edge. We actually see this exact dynamic playing out in the world right now, like with the incredible motivation of the Ukrainian resistance defending their home against a much larger Russian military. Section 2. The Soviet Blunder. A Fatal Pivot East. So, realizing that invading Britain was pretty much a lost cause for the moment, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion. He needed a new target. And what's really interesting to analyze here is the reasoning behind this massive strategic error to pivot toward the Soviet Union, his supposed ally. It was completely driven by extreme ideology and just a deep hatred for communists. He firmly believed that to make Germany the ultimate superpower, he needed that vast Soviet territory. He was suffering from total megalomania, just a delusional obsession with power, genuinely believing he was destined to rule the whole world. This delusion is exactly what birthed Operation Barbarossa, kicking off on June 22, 1941. Hitler basically tried to copy-paste his success in France by dividing his forces into three massive prongs. Step 1, push north toward Leningrad. Step 2, drive straight into the heart of the country to take Moscow. And Step 3, sweep south right through Ukraine. At first, using their rapid blitzkrieg tactics, the Germans moved unbelievably fast. They captured huge swaths of land and pushed to within just 300 kilometers of Moscow in a matter of weeks. But let's just put into perspective the sheer scale of what Germany was walking into. The Soviet Union had roughly 20,000 tanks. Germany had about 6,000. Now, sure, Germany initially had the upper hand because their technology and their tactics were far superior. but you can only stretch an army so far. Internal command disagreements caused absolutely crucial delays, pushing the whole advance into October. And then the harsh Russian winter hit. The German war machine literally froze in its tracks. This handed a massive environmental advantage to the Soviets, who were perfectly accustomed to fighting in that bitter cold.
Section 3. A global war. The conflict expands. Up until the end of 1941, this conflict was largely contained to Europe and parts of North Africa. But then, the entire scope of history just completely shifted. 2,300. That is the devastating number of American troops killed on a single day in December 1941. Out of nowhere, with absolutely no provocation, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Until this very moment, America had stubbornly stayed out of it, just watching Europe from afar. But this attack instantly dragged a massive, reluctant industrial powerhouse right into the war, officially aligning the U.S. with the Allied forces, joining the UK, the Soviet Union, and China.
Section 4. The tides turn. Axis powers lose grip.
With the United States now in the mix and the Soviet Union successfully halting the German advance in the east, we start to see a staggering domino effect of Axis defeats. Let's run through them. June 1942, the U.S. shatters Japanese naval dominance at the Battle of Midway. By February 1943, after enduring the deadliest battle of the war through a brutal winter, the Soviets forced the surrender of 300,000 German troops at Stalingrad. That was arguably the single biggest blow to the entire German war machine. A few months later in July, the Italian people revolted and ousted Mussolini. And then, of course, the monumental D-Day landings in June 1944 brought massive Allied forces right onto mainland Europe.
Oh, and before we move on to the collapse, here's a really fascinating cultural Easter egg from that Italian uprising. The civilians who took up arms against their dictator were known as partisans, and they're the ones who eventually captured and executed Mussolini. Well, it was among these brave anti-fascist civilians during this exact period that the famous resistance song Bella Ciao originated. So if you've heard that song in the hit show Money Heist, just remember that it actually stems from right here, from the real-life struggle for Italian freedom. Pretty wild, right?
Section 5. The Axis collapses. The final squeeze.
So the crucial point here is that with the momentum completely against them, the whole pace of the war shifted to this somber, inevitable final squeeze. Germany simply could not sustain a multi-front war. Following D-Day, with 150,000 heavily supplied Allied soldiers pushing in from the west, Hitler panicked. He started withdrawing troops from the east just to compensate. And the second he did that, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, rapidly gaining back 600 kilometers of territory. Hitler tried one last desperate push in the west, the Battle of the Bulge, but it failed. Germany's forces were totally stretched to the breaking point, surrounded on three sides.
30,000. As the vice closed on Germany, those final 4 months of the war became intensely painful. Almost 30,000 people were killed every single day. As Allied forces pushed further into German territory, they uncovered the horrifying reality of Hitler's concentration camps, where hundreds of thousands of innocent Jews had been cruelly murdered. Meanwhile, up in the skies, Allied forces were carrying out devastating and highly controversial aerial bombings on German civilian cities, completely crumbling places like Dresden to the ground.
Section 6. A new world order. A transformed globe.
By April 1945, Berlin was completely surrounded. Following Hitler's suicide, Germany formally surrendered on May 8th. But you have to understand, the end of the fighting was really just the beginning of a massive transformation. From the ashes of this incomprehensible destruction, the map of Europe was literally redrawn. German territories were divided into East and West Germany. Poland was recreated out of former East German territory. Borders everywhere were shifting. But honestly, perhaps the most significant outcome was that these new governments realized that if they wanted to survive, old historical enmities, especially that bitter, long-standing rivalry between Germany and France, just had to end once and for all. And this brilliantly illustrates how that absolute necessity for survival built the Europe we know today. The continent began step 1 by forming the European Coal and Steel Committee, basically forcing direct economic cooperation between France and Germany. Over the years, step 2 expanded that trade network to include neighbors like Italy and Britain. Ultimately, this economic integration evolved into step 3, the establishment of the European Union, which practically erased borders between member countries. Economic cooperation literally replaced centuries of historical hatred, and it secured decades of unprecedented peace on the continent. But the rebuilding didn't just stop at Europe's borders. The victorious Allied nations wanted to ensure that a conflict of this magnitude could never, ever happen again. So they explicitly built the global institutions that govern our world today. In October 1945, the United Nations was established, with the major Allied forces sitting as its permanent members. This was quickly followed by the creation of the World Bank, the IMF, and eventually the NATO military alliance. The entire geopolitical framework we live in today, it was forged right here in the aftermath of this war.
Yet, as we wrap up, we really have to remember that Germany's surrender in May did not end World War II. Japan kept fighting for months. It wasn't until Japan ignored a surrender ultimatum in July 1945 that the United States unleashed a terrifying new era, dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Which leaves us with this final, profound question. Looking at the tens of millions of lives lost, the cities turned to ash, and the dawn of the atomic age, what truly was the ultimate cost of this conflict? And as you look around at the borders, the alliances, and the institutions today, how deeply does the legacy of these blunders still shape the very world we live in right now? Think about that. And thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you next time.